the first meeting of the Charlotte Economic Recovery Task Force Airport Working Group, and that's quite a mouthful. My name is Ed Driggs. I'm the District 7 member of Charlotte City Council and coordinator for this group. As you know, our mission is to study the impact of the COVID virus on the airport and all of its stakeholders, and to make recommendations to Charlotte City Council on how we can expedite a recovery to normal operation there. This is a public meeting. It's being broadcast on the government channel, or you can view it on the city's Facebook or YouTube channels. In future meetings, we will be entertaining public input by having written submissions that will then be considered by task force members. And so if you have questions, please write in and let us know, and we will take them up. I'd like, before we get underway, to hand over to Donata for a moment to talk about some of the mechanics of this call. Donata?
Hi, so good morning. Thank you, Councilmember Driggs. My name is Donata Jackson. I'm the Office of Constituent Services Manager. I just wanted to remind everyone that is on the virtual call to be sure that you're speaking directly into your mic so that we can hear you. After your introductions, your mic will be muted. So during your introductions, Mr. Driggs will go and ask everyone to introduce themselves. We're going to unmute everyone's mic, but after then, we will mute you. If you'd like to say something, if you move your mouse around, the center icon, it's a little person with 3 lines. Click on that. It's called Participants. That'll open up a panel on your right-hand side. You can then raise your hand. There's a little tiny hand raise. Once you do that, that'll indicate to me and Councilmember Driggs that you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, and we'll call upon you, and Wendy will then unmute you, okay? So just remember to move your mouse around, go to that center small person with the 3 lines called Participants, open up that right-hand panel. There's a hand raise. You can click that hand raise, and then to unclick it, just click it back, and it'll take your hand down once you've asked your question or made your comment. If there are any issues, feel free to either message us in the chat function, or you can text me directly. I'll give you my phone number. It's 704-363-5104, 704-363-5104. Glad you're here, and thank you so much.
All right. So before we get underway, I'd like to do a quick roll call of the members who are on the call. As I mention your name, would you please just introduce yourself and state your affiliation, your company affiliation? Larkin Eggleston.
Yes, sir. Good morning. Larkin Eggleston, Charlotte City Council member representing District 1.
Victoria.
Good morning.
Victoria has been abducted by aliens.
I've been abducted.
So that is Victoria Watkington, our District 3 council member. Matt, are you with us? Okay.
Matt? Morning.
Matt, there you are. Matt is our District 5 council member. Right, Matt. Rachel.
Hi, good morning. Rachel Geathers, concessionaire at the Charlotte Douglas International Airport.
Thank you, Rachel.
If anybody's watching the Facebook Live is muted.
Yeah, we've got a feedback back there somewhere.
So if you have another device on, and that other device could be a television, it could be Facebook, it could be YouTube, just please mute that device. It could even be your cell phone. You have to mute that device. The only thing that we need to hear are your mics on your computer. Okay, there we are. Okay, Rachel, go ahead with your introduction.
Are they all unmuted? I'm showing all the microphones as muted. Dennis, are you here? Lucia is here. Aaron is here. I believe all the members of the working group are here. But we need to identify where that audio problem is. It sounds like somebody has a Facebook page or a YouTube open, and that's creating a feedback loop. Okay. I wanted to mention also that representatives from American Airlines, Parodies, HMS Host, may be also on the call to answer questions and hear our deliberations. Wanted to mention also thank you to the staff for pulling all of this together. It's a lot of work. So Donato, Wendy, Angela, and others, thank you so much. Today's meeting is to deal with the airport itself. Subject to input from others, my intention would be to focus on concessionaires at next week's meeting and to have American Airlines as the featured speaker the week after that. And beyond that, we can all talk among ourselves about what further topics or agendas we might want to adopt. I'm hoping that this process can be wrapped up in a matter of about 4 weeks or so. So having said all of that, I wanted to hand off to Brent Cagle, who is going to brief us about the airport this morning, and financialist is going to talk about the concessionaires. Brent, why don't you take it away?
All right, thank you. Thank you to all of the members of the task force for asking me to present this morning. Haley and I will go through a couple brief presentations. Okay. Everyone should be seeing the presentations at this point, or my presentation at this point. All right, let's see. Page down. We seem to be having a little bit of issue with the slide advancement. Oh, there it goes. Thank you. You're welcome. Technical support has never been more important in the new COVID world. Okay, with that, so starting off, and I will move through these quickly, but I also will have opportunity at the end for questions. So looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the aviation department and on Charlotte Douglas International Airport, the first thing to look at is what has been the impact to the airport's enplaned passengers. And I want to sort of, number one, say, if I utilize acronyms, I will try not to do that. If I do, I apologize. Please just ask me to clarify. But I also want to define terms because you will see this throughout the presentation. So enplaned passengers or enplanements is basically roughly half of total passengers, right? There are enplaning passengers and there are deplaning passengers. So when you see numbers, for example, in January of this year, the airport announced that we had 50 million total passengers. That would be 25 million enplaned passengers. So enplanements are roughly half of total. So for enplaned passengers in FY19, we had just under 24 million total enplaned passengers. For our budget in the current year, so back when we set our current year budget, we had anticipated growth. So from 23.9, we had anticipated to go to 24.2 million total enplanements. We have now revised those estimates for FY20 based on the effects of COVID-19, and we are now projecting 18.7, 18.8 million total employments at the airport. And what that really is reflective of three fiscal quarters of very strong growth, and then COVID-19, the impacts of COVID-19 really starting to show their effects at CLT in March. Because of that, we have created a budget around that. So before COVID-19, we were deep into our budget process, and that's what the next column stands for, FY21 original budget. So as we were setting our budget for FY21, but before COVID-19, we had anticipated 26.1 million annual employments. That has been revised down, and that's what you see, the FY21 current budget. So what that really is our latest thinking on where our employments will be for next fiscal year, our fiscal year starting in July. And we're seeing about a 24% decrease down to just under, 18.49 million employments. So about a 24% decrease FY20 budget to our current thinking on FY21's budget. Now I'll get into a little bit more. All of these numbers are based on a base case recovery scenario, and I'll get into that a little bit more on the next few slides. Then in landed weight, we're seeing again, and I won't go through all of these, but I'll cut to the chase on this. We're seeing significant reductions in landed weight, although landed weight is not reduced as much as the employments, and that's really reflective of American Airlines and the other carriers at Charlotte continuing to fly routes, but those aircraft are, they're by and large empty. There are very few passengers on those aircraft, but American and the other airlines are continuing to provide service for the passengers that are flying right now. So another activity update, where we're at right now. We have seen, as we've been moving through COVID-19 crisis, we have seen employments reduce to basically 5% of previous. So they have been reduced by 95%. And we are projecting the recovery to begin in August of this year. So our revenue summary, obviously the vast majority of our revenues are dependent on passenger activity. Airline revenues for the FY20 budget, we estimated $90.6 million in airline revenues. And what that means is that's how much we would charge the airlines who use Charlotte Douglas International Airport for the services and the facilities that they use. All airline billings by federal requirement are cost-based. There is no net revenues when it comes to airline billings. So really, when we talk about airline revenues, that also is the same number as the expense that the airport incurs to provide the facilities and services that the airlines use to conduct their business. So in FY20, we had an original budget of $90.6 million. That estimate has reduced to $81.5 million. And again, you can see for the original budget, the pre-COVID-19 budget, we had estimated $98.5 million. So again, our current estimate is far off from where we thought we would be in 21, which has led us to a new revised fiscal year 21 current budget, airline revenues of $79.7 million. Going to the non-airline side. So these are predominantly made up of terminal concessionaires, parking, those kinds of revenues that are operating revenues that come in. Now, these revenues, there is a margin on them. There are net revenues, and these are the revenues that we rely on as an enterprise fund. We do not receive local tax dollars. These are the revenues that we rely on to maintain our financial metrics, to pay our operating costs, and to fund either debt service for future capital projects or to directly fund capital projects on a pay-as-you-go basis. So you can see there has been a significant decline in these revenues. So FY20 budget was $154 million. The revised estimate is $120 million. So a roughly $34 million, $35 million decline in revenues for the current fiscal year. In FY21, pre-COVID-19, we were estimating $165 million in non-airline revenues. And again, we're now projecting FY21 revenues to be flat and maintain at about $120 million. So again, a significant decrease from where we thought we would be going into FY21, about a $45 million decrease in non-airline revenues. All of these revenues, again, are based on the employment levels and the forecast that we have for recovery, where we're at today, and the forecast that we have for recovery. So the next few slides try to graphically depict where we are and where we think we'll be. So this slide graphically depicts, using 2019 as the index, employment activity month by month, starting in July 19, which is the first month of fiscal year 20 for the city and the airport, and running through through the end of fiscal year 21. So you can see April of 20 is the low point. That's basically where we are, and employments have dropped to next to zero. Using our forecast and using industry information, we project a recovery into fiscal year 21, but that recovery will top out at about 90% of previous year's monthly activity, and we get to about 90% of previous years around January of 2021, and we maintain at that level throughout the rest of the fiscal year. And what that really is indicative of is once we get to that level, what we think is growth will be slow growth, it will be normal growth based on economic conditions, the economy as a whole, and on regional conditions in the economy. And so you basically get to 90% of where we were on a monthly basis, and then we hold steady with standard growth. So this is showing projected employment scenarios, and this shows the increase from where we are in April 20. And this shows three scenarios. The first scenario, the top line, CLT original, is really the employment forecast that we had pre-COVID-19. The middle line, CLT current, is the employment or recovery forecast that we are currently using as we're building as we have built our fiscal year 21 budget. Then we also have a slow recovery scenario, and that slow recovery, you can see, is the bottom line. We're not sure where we will end up being as we recover. We are planning and basing our planning on the current activity forecast, but we are also running our models for a possible slow recovery. In a slow recovery, rather than getting to about 90% of where we were in the prior year by January of 21, we get to about 50% of where we were in the prior year by January of 2021. And we maintain that level with standard growth beyond that. So the base case scenario, the current scenario that we're using, we also wanted to give you some information on why we think it's a reasonable forecast to use right now. We have been consulting with other airports, with industry groups, with investment banks, with the rating agencies, and what you can see are there are three different scenarios here, one from Fitch Rating Agency, one from JP Morgan, and then the Charlotte base case forecast. And we are basically falling, in effect, right between those two. This is the Fitch and the JP Morgan are really based on industry outlooks as a whole. They are not specific to Charlotte, but they are based on their thinking on the industry as a whole and what the industry recovery could look like. And so we feel good at where we're at right now, but we also are prepared to make adjustments to our operating budgets if we start to see that the base case scenario is overly optimistic. We are prepared to make those adjustments as we move into FY21 and start to understand better what the true recovery looks like. So our priorities in responding to COVID-19. First priority, obviously, is sustaining airport operations, supporting our mission-critical operations, safety, security, making sure that the terminal is accessible, that the airfield is operational. While I think we all know that as I've said, the employment forecast is down, there are still 10 to 15,000 people daily utilizing the airport, and they are traveling because they need to travel. Right? Those can be doctors, they can be people trying to get back home if they were stranded during this crisis. There are folks who need to travel, and so the airfield and the terminal are imperative for us to sustain those operations. Second priority, protecting aviation department employees. This is an obligation of the 2020 CARES Act or the stimulus funds that are now available for Charlotte Douglas International Airport. As we have made our budget adjustments, our operating budget adjustments, our commitment has been no reductions in staff. If you work for the aviation department, your job is safe. Now, we have taken actions just like the city on hiring freeze, and we may have reductions in total staffing levels through attrition, but we are not considering at this point a reduction in force. The third item, commitment to our investors. The aviation department has about $800 million of outstanding debt. We have made commitments to our investors, and we need to comply with those obligations under the terms and conditions of the CLT bond order. So that is a primary commitment. And the fourth is supporting our business partners. We're looking to be, we understand that this is hard times for everyone involved in the travel industry, and we're looking to be flexible and find ways to create relief as we all get through this period. Our immediate reactions. So the first thing that we did is, as I said, the current fiscal year is really, it's kind of a tale of two financial forecasts. 3 extraordinary quarters followed by what is shaping up to be the worst quarter that we have ever had when it comes to reduction in service. So the first things that we did is for the first 6 months of the year, we calculated the rough amount of profit share that would be due under the airline use agreement, the existing airline use agreement, to the signatory airlines, and we released the first 6 months of profit sharing to the airlines. We did that about 3 weeks ago. That money they are entitled to under the terms and conditions of their use agreement. So this really wasn't something that we went outside of the use agreement. It was just making those funds available a little bit earlier than we have in the past. The second thing we did, we received in the current year, well, we are in the process of receiving the first year of funding from the North Carolina Airport Improvement Grant Program. This is a new program that the General Assembly approved last year for this budget year. It is about $28 million that CLT is provided under the North Carolina Airport Improvement Grant Program. We immediately programmed the NCAIP funding towards our current debt service obligations in the current fiscal year. And these are debt service obligations that are not already backed by other federal sources like Federal Airport Improvement Grant Program or passenger facility charges. We also have reduced our O&M budget, our operations and maintenance expenses for the current year and for next year, corresponding with the impacts to the business. We've adjusted our capital improvement program, and we are evaluating how to utilize the Airport CARES Act funding. Some of the things that we've done on the operating side: a hiring freeze, restrictions on overtime, elimination of any requested new positions for next fiscal year, and a reduction in service levels on demand-driven contracts. And now these are contracts these are contracted parties that provide services to the airport. This is not tenants or airlines. These would be folks who are contracted by the airport, and they're on service level driven contracts. So as the need for certain services has reduced down to zero, the contract spend on those, or the spend on those contracts has also been significantly reduced and will remain reduced until demand returns. The other things that we did were sort of the no-brainers. What everyone does is travel and training, memberships, marketing dollars. Those kinds of things have been significantly reduced or eliminated from our operating budget for fiscal year 20 and for the remainder of fiscal year 20 and for fiscal year 21. Debt service and capital outlays. Again, I mentioned the NCAIP, and we have eliminated or postponed capital outlays associated with equipment and rolling stock for fiscal year 21. We have also suspended or delayed new major capital projects. Concourse A expansion phase 2. It's currently under design and had been anticipated to move into construction soon. So we are finishing design and we are deferring or delaying start of construction on that project until we can see what the COVID-19 recovery really looks like and we are comfortable that demand has returned enough to warrant. Our Joint Operations Center, again, we have deferred that project. We are making do with an alternate project that does not involve a new facility, but will retrofit an existing facility, and that will allow us to avoid the majority of the cost associated with that contract. The concessionaires, we were working on a distribution and receiving center that would be for the use of the concessionaires at the airport. That project has been canceled and may come back based on demand at some point in the future, but its future is unknown. And the Federal Inspection Service and Concourse D renovations, this is the international arrivals area. Again, the design has been deferred pending the recovery. Major capital projects that are proceeding. The terminal lobby expansion is already underway and is continuing. Concourse E expansion, phase 9, is underway and continuing. A ramp expansion, our fuel farm expansion, and then a couple design and construction projects related to the airfield, our north end-around taxiway and our south crossfield taxiway. The design is continuing, and today we anticipate moving forward with construction, but that could change depending on the status of the recovery. So looking at what this means on, we always talk about Charlotte's very competitive position when it comes to cost per enplaned passenger, or CPE. Charlotte is by far the lowest CPE, or has the lowest CPE of any large hub airport in the business, and that is a huge financial strength for the airport, and it also is very, very important to the airlines that serve the airport. So I will focus on the bottom row, which is the total all airline cost per enplaned passenger. In FY19, it was $1.55. For the budget of 2020, we projected $1.99. Currently, we are estimating $2.42 for the current end of 2020. Under the base case scenario, we project next year's CPE for 2021 to be $2.38. Under a slow recovery scenario, that CPE could rise to $4.77. Now remember, cost per employment is a multivariable calculation. It's taking all of the costs that the airlines pay us for using the facility and dividing it by the employments. So while we will cut and continue to cut costs, as employments drop off precipitously, it has an effect on the CPE. And this is true industry-wide. So our budget summary. Again, this shows you all of the key metrics that we utilize for the budget. And so you can see, I won't go into every one of these because a lot of these have already been talked about, but this basically shows all of it in summary. It shows the reductions and really where we think we'll be. Again, you have the FY 2021 budget, which is based on the base case recovery scenario, and then you have the FY 2021 slow recovery or worst case scenario columns. So we are a AA rated airport, which is the highest rating that airports are given by the rating agencies. We're really proud of that. And we want to maintain that because that significantly reduces our cost of capital when we issue debt. We have financial metrics and targets established, and these targets are very important. They are in our annual financial report every year, and the investors watch these, and they watch the airport's reaction in the good times and in the bad times, and they watch that we are committed to maintaining our targets as we committed to them when we issue that debt. So the first is days cash on hand. This is really a measure of liquidity for the airport. Another thing about these is management's target is based on the industry medians or the rating agency medians for AA rated airports. So these were not just sort of thought up by me or by my finance staff. A lot goes into these, and they can change over time because rating agency expectations change. Right now, days cash on hand or liquidity, the rating agencies would say 800 days for a large hub, AA rated airport is really where we need to be. We have always had strong liquidity, and we will maintain liquidity throughout the recovery above the target. Now, again, you'll note that liquidity starts to decline out into 2025. Again, remember, what we really focus on this, you can think about this chart almost as a stoplight chart, right? Above the target is green. Near the target, within plus or minus 2 or 3% is yellow. Below the target becomes red. If one metric is red in 1 year, that's not particularly alarming, especially if it's in the out years. What that really means is as we move through our planning process, those become things that we start to work to fix. But if the whole chart is red, that is alarming. So right now, and these are financial metrics based on our base case scenario and our current FY21 budget. So liquidity is good. Our passenger facility charge fund balance remaining. We target about $50 million as a minimum fund balance. Again, we're in the good range. We're significantly above that now, and we're in a good range right now. The PFC leverage, so this is how leveraged we are on our passenger facility charge cash flows. Again, we want to keep that within 80%. We are good on that right now. We have some work to do in the out years. Our GARB, so GARB is General Airport Revenue Bonds. These are bonds that the city issues. They are not taxpayer supported, and they are not supported or paid via federal sources. So these GARBs roll directly into airline rates and charges. So GARBs, we look at our debt per enplaned passengers. Again, we're looking at $60 per enplaned passenger. And again, we feel confident that we're in a reasonable spot. Our debt service coverage, or DSC, there are two ways to calculate DSC, and that's why they're on here. The first is the way that is required under our bond ordinance. And again, I'll talk through this, but the DSC for the bond ordinance requires, or our target is 2 times. And you can see we are significantly above 2 times. We're in safe category. The reason we calculate debt service coverage under the ratings method is because rating agencies, generally speaking, do not calculate debt service coverage the way that our bond order does. And I won't go into the weeds of why that is. This is very common for airports. And so while we calculate debt service coverage by the bond ordinance, we also know that every rating analyst that we ever talk to is going to ask for debt service coverage the way they calculate it. So we just go ahead and make that calculation for them. Again, the target is 150 or 1.5 times. And again, we are maintaining that throughout. And then we have our cost per employment. Now, there is no target on this because the lower the better. Maintaining a very competitive cost per employment is the goal. And again, you can see we are doing that. Again, in 2025, we need to structure and we need to take another look at how we fix that. But that's what we will be doing as we progress through the years and as we see what the recovery looks like. The CARES Act. So CLT has received an allocation. We received final notification from the FAA 9 days ago. So recently, CLT's allocation is $135 million. The funds can be used for any lawful airport expense. The FAA identifies some priorities for that, and our uses are in line with those priorities. First is making sure that we can pay debt service. So the first bucket is to, again, pay our debt service for fiscal year 2021. The second bucket is because passenger facility charges are driven by passenger volume, we will see a decline in the amount of passenger facility charges that we collect. So we have some debt outstanding that is backed by PFC cash flows. So we will utilize stimulus funds to augment or supplement and make sure that we can make those debt service payments on the PFC backed debt. We also have existing projects that are underway that are pay-as-you-go capital projects being paid out of PFC collections. Again, PFC collections are reduced, so we will utilize CARES Act funding to continue those projects to keep the cash flow sufficient. Beyond that, we are evaluating how we can utilize the remainder of the CARES Act funding for 2 things. One, to cover FY 2021's operating expenses. These are operating expenses for the aviation department. And two, if it makes sense to bring back some of the capital projects that we have deferred sooner. If the recovery we think is stronger than we thought, then it may make sense while traffic is still diminished to bring back some of these capital projects. But that is the final bucket, and at this point we're really making no guesses as to whether or not that will be feasible. Really what we are looking at is the first two buckets, debt service, PFCs, and then O&M. With that, I will turn it over to questions, if there are any.
If you have any questions, if you could virtually raise your hand.
I'm not seeing the raise hand option, but this is Larkin. I've got one. But I think you might have to enable the option for folks to raise their hand because it's not where I would usually find it during our council meetings. Brent, thank you for the presentation. My question's about our CPE number, which I know is one of our significant competitive advantages against some of our peer airports. As we see that likely to increase, I didn't hear you say if our peer or competitive airport set would also probably be seeing a similar increase, and thereby we maintain our advantage in that metric, or whether that's unique to us.
So, yes, sir. So could we go back to the presentation? So you are absolutely right. Everybody's CPE climbs when employments go down. And while everyone will make adjustments to their cost of O&M, again, the amount of facilities that we are using is the same today. So there are certain basic requirements that we have to utilize, that we have to meet to keep the airport safe and operational. So the CPE for all airports is going to do sort of funny things, but ours, because it started out lower, will remain lower than others. The other thing I will point out to you, well, two more things that I'll point out. One is the actual CPE for FY 2021 would be or will be impacted as we start to make decisions about CARES Act funding that would go towards covering O&M. And it would be impacted in a positive direction, i.e. it will be reduced. So for this presentation and for the assumptions that we've made in the budget, we have not assumed any specific use of CARES Act funding towards O&M yet, but we will be making those decisions. The other thing I will point out on this slide, so because CPE is doing funny things, what we really focused on, if you look at the bottom line on this, the bottom row, that net airline payments is basically how much the airlines pay us to use the facility netted against the projected profit share annually. So one of the things that we were absolutely seeking to do just in budget reductions, and that we've already done without utilizing CARES Act funding yet, is keep the net airline payments flat, or in this case, reduced. So you can see the FY 2020 estimated net airline payments of $59.2 million against an FY 2021 budget of $56.3 million. So that has been achieved even with the losses in operating revenues, so a reduction in the profit share with commensurate reductions in operating budget. What we use the CARES Act, when we use the CARES Act funding towards O&M, those numbers will just get better, and that will be reflected in a lowered CPE.
Mr. Eggleston, are you good?
Brent, it's Ed. The reduced traffic, the resumption back to 90%, are we assuming that the limitations there are related to the economy, or are there likely to be kind of restrictions on air travel even after the stay-at-home order is lifted, because the threat of the virus is expected to continue. How exactly do we think that is going to evolve? Are we going to have airplanes crowded with people starting as soon as the stay-at-home order is lifted, or what measures need to be taken?
So that is an excellent question. I think if there's anyone who has surety in their answer to that question, I would love to talk to them. We don't know. What we think is the industry is going to change. How people travel, customer preferences when they're in the airport, how they park, all of those things will be fundamentally changed. And because of that, we really are not assuming that even after we recover, we're really making the assumption that there's a new normal. In the base case scenario, the new normal looks like about 90% of where we were. In the worst case scenario, the new normal looks like about 50% of where we were.
I would like to acknowledge that Tracy Montross from American Airlines is on the call, and I'm sure American has a lot to say about that as well. Our intention is to have a session devoted to American Airlines as the 90% kind of tenant at the airport in a couple of weeks. So, Tracy, thank you for joining us today, but I don't think I'm going to start down the road of asking you questions right now about how you see these things. The other thing I'm interested in is when the government provides money like that and they say it can be used for any airport operation, we have been struggling in the city to interpret some of these things, and in particular some funds we received yesterday. So any lawful airport expense, as we move forward and we're thinking of ways to kind of address the repercussions of this, does lawful airport expense afford you any latitude to negotiate with people who are contract partners or whatever, and fund, some changes with the federal government money, or is it really limited to your O&M line items and the things that you spend on your normal operations?
Yeah. So there's a couple reasons that the FAA has put this out here. One is it's just the norm. What they're really saying is revenue diversion rules still apply. So you can't take the $135 million and use that for things that you couldn't use airport revenues for before. Revenue diversion rules absolutely still apply. The other thing they're saying is really you can't use it to just, one thing that you could say is, well, the impact of COVID-19 means a reduction, an estimated reduction of $45 million in my revenues. So I'll just take $45 million and put it towards airport revenues, and that'll be that. It has to be a documented expense of the aviation department. It has to be one of our expenses, because while there is a streamlined application process, we will still have to apply for the use of the funds and then provide specific documentation as to how the funds were used. So it really has to be a documentable expense on the aviation department side.
Right, because we're operating under similar constraints in the city. So I think as we get further into this conversation, we'll see what the limitations are that imposes. I notice we do have a hand up. Lucia?
One question. There is a lot of talk about an infrastructure package coming out because of COVID. Are there any specific projects that Charlotte Douglas can submit or benefit from that package on?
Yes, there is a lot of talk about it, and Charlotte Douglas, so myself and Mike Hill, the airport CFO, are working with Dana Fenton right now to pull together a short list of projects that we think would be good candidates if additional CARES Act funding for infrastructure comes out. So the answer is yes, there are about 4 or 5 projects that we have already identified as good candidates.
Thank you.
And Mr. Driggs, Mr. Bennett has he does not have his hand up, but he does have a question.
I see his hand is up, in fact. And Seth, I think you got lost in the cuckoo clock during the introduction. So could you just briefly tell us who you are and your affiliation?
Sure. Thank you, Ed. Seth Bennett here, the Spectrum Center in Charlotte Hornet, Senior Vice President, Consumer Engagement. Brent, thank you for your presentation. I have two questions for you. Just to clarify for me, how many of the actual emplanements originate in Charlotte? And recently there was a report that the FAA may be adjusting the amount allocated to airports. There was at least a media report. Is that somewhat factual? Is that a possibility that 135 could be increased? Thank you.
So the two questions: one, how many of our passengers are local passengers? Historically, over the last couple of years, it has been about, for all airlines, about a 70-30 mix, 70% connecting passengers, 30% local passengers. That local passenger mix has been growing steadily and very strong over the last 5 years, and as we recover, we would expect that trend to continue. Your second question related to CARES Act funding. I have not heard that there may be additional CARES Act funding associated with airports, but if that's a discussion being had, we certainly support it, and I can follow up with Mr. Fenton to determine, but I have not heard that there are additional funds imminent specific to CARES Act or future CARES Act related to airports.
Thank you.
Hey, Brent, I thought I understood that question to mean there could be some reapportionment of the funds. I don't know if I got that right, but are you confident in the 135?
Yes.
All right. Aaron, I see your hand is up. If you could tell us your affiliation and ask your question, please.
Sure. Erin King Sweeney. I'm recently moved to Charlotte from New York last fall. I'm an aviation lawyer for about 20 years. I'm delighted to participate with you. And my question has to do with what plans has the airport made to start instituting social distancing measures once the travel starts to increase again. I've been talking to JFK a lot about this, and they're trying to figure it out. So once people start flying again, how do they handle it safely? And I don't think they have an answer yet.
Yeah, and we're just like JFK and every other airport in the country. We are at the point where we are trying to figure that out too. You know, I think that our response to COVID-19, I'm going to break it down into three kind of categories so far. The first was really purely operational. What do we do when we start staggered staffing? How do we ensure that we have staffing necessary over the length of this crisis? It was really focused on operational and staffing needs. The second phase, we really started talking about financial implications and what do we think the recovery looks like. And I would say right now we're at the tail end of that second phase, and I think airports in general are at the front end of the third phase, which is really trying to determine what an airport looks like post-COVID-19, because it will not be the same. Some of the services we provided, I'll give you a great example. Right now, one of our best parking products, Business Valet, that has been a great parking product. It is closed right now. We have 28,000 parking spots at the airport, 22,000 of which are closed because of no demand. We're starting to look at what does it look like as demand comes back. Business Valet, will customers accept a parking product that has a stranger getting in their car? And if they do, what do we need to do to ensure that they're safe and their cars are sanitized before they get back in? But there are 1,000 questions on the airline side, on the concessionaire side, and on the airport side. And that's really what we're looking at now is what are passenger expectations going to be, and how do we provide services in the way passengers want it to make them feel safe when they're traveling in the future. And we have some ideas about that, but we have just launched a stakeholder work group with all of the stakeholders at the airport to talk about that. What does post-COVID-19 operations look like?
So we do have another agenda item, and we're actually behind our intended timeline. Robert, I see you have your hand up. Can I remind you, after your question has been answered, take your hand down again so you don't get called a second time. So Aaron and Lucia, your hands are still up. And I'll take one question, if we can, quickly from Robert before we move on to Haley Gentry.
Thanks, Ed. So mine is, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Mine is really more of a comment, and that is, if I look at, Brent, if I look at your pro formas going back to 90%, in what I would consider, a fairly short period of time, I can tell you that my business is, that is extremely optimistic, right, for at least for my business. Having said that, I will tell you that there is strong, in my company, pent-up demand for domestic travel and for international travel. And it's just such an interesting dichotomy in that, we don't see our business bouncing back to 90% as quickly, but I can tell you our people are clamoring to get back on airplanes to go see their customers and see their suppliers. So I just share that with the group.
Councilman Driggs, if I may, one last comment. I will say that CLT, because of our efficiency and financial effectiveness, in downturns, CLT has routinely fared better in the reductions in service than other airports, and we have routinely fared better in recovery. We're not making assumptions on that, but we do think history is a good indicator. And I will say this is really the advantage of being a primary hub for American Airlines. It's also, this is where our cost advantage counts in a downturn. We have a huge cost advantage over every other airport in the country when it comes to CPE. And it's in these hard financial times that really pays off for us. And it is our intention to do everything we can to safeguard our metrics and be on the front end of the recovery, whatever that recovery looks like.
Thank you, Brent. I think the takeaway from what you've told us is that the airport is fortunate to be in a strong financial position, does have the benefit of the government support, and therefore, as it stands right now, can weather this crisis without disastrous consequences, if that's a fair synopsis. I would like to move on to Haley Gentry, who is the Chief Business and Information Officer at the airport, and is going to give us a quick overview of the airport's business relationships with concessionaires. Haley, are you there?
I sure am. Thank you, Councilmember Driggs. And good morning, task force members and council members. My name is Haley Gentry, and as the airport's CBIO, I am responsible for managing the airport concession program. I have a great team that supports this program. I'd specifically like to mention Ted Kaplan and Jennifer Long. They're both on the call. And we also have two very well-respected industry leaders that are our concession partners for in-terminal concessions, and that would be Host International and Paradise Lagardère. So we're very fortunate to have both of these companies who have international reputations in Charlotte and really great working relationships with both of them. And as a supplement to that, Charlotte is also fortunate to have a very well-respected group of local business owners known as ACDBEs, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Next slide, Wendy. I'm going to try and go quickly through this in observance of time so we can have Q&A at the end. But I'm going to try and share with you a very high-level overview of what is the airport concession program. I'm going to hit the highlights of two very complicated long-term contracts. These contracts are essential to the airport's revenue portfolio. And keep in mind, the FAA tasked the airport with being financially self-sufficient, and this is one of the ways we do this. Combined, this program produces almost $50 million in revenue a year for the airport, which is the second highest non-aeronautical revenue stream behind airport parking. So you'll see some of the details here. Host is the food and beverage provider, Paradies is the retail. Combined, we have well over 100 locations, and many of those are operated by ACDBEs. You do have some ACDBEs who are operating in both contracts. That is not unusual. As I said, we have a very sophisticated group of ACDBE operators here, and that is not unusual for Charlotte, although unusual for some markets. You can see the gross sales for each company, and then you can see the net revenue. Our agreement is based on a profit sharing agreement, so they not only pay us 50% of the net revenue, but we also collect a space rental on top of that. So you'll see airport revenue, net revenues for Host are $34 million, and for Paradies, they are $15 million. With 20% of the gross sales for Host being generated by an ACDBE and 26% of the gross sales for Paradies being generated by an ACDBE operator. Next slide, please. So what is an ACDBE? This is a federally defined program, and we do have staff that manages this as an extension of our legal team. Charlotte is very fortunate to have very sophisticated and very successful ACDBEs. It is not always the situation. Many of my counterparts at other airports are continually dealing with struggling ACDBEs, and I think that is a testament to the master concessionaires, Paradies and Host, being able to vet and well match people who not only meet the brand requirements, but can financially and business-wise actually manage the commitment that it takes to operate in an airport environment. It is very different operating in an airport environment. Many of our ACDBEs do have street businesses, and I think they are the first ones to tell you that there is a dramatic difference. The requirements that you see on the screen, we've really reduced them. As you can imagine, the federal descriptions are very lengthy, but these are the top criteria. 51% owned by a socially and economically disadvantaged person based on the federal description of that, and then controlled by one or more of these individuals who own it. You cannot exceed $56 million in 3 fiscal years of revenue. Again, the 51% ownership, and your net worth cannot exceed $1.32 million. So what does that really look like in our environment? I thought some of you may find these demographics interesting. Clearly, this varies from airport to airport and what region of the country or the world that you may be in. I think that all of these titles are the federally defined groups, and this is what it looks like for us here in Charlotte. Next slide, Wendy. So what does the contract actually look like? I mentioned to you that both of these firms are very well respected in the industry. They are the leaders in this type of business. For those of you who have been around a while, HMS Host was a former name for Host International. You may remember it as Host Marriott. These are familiar names, but Host has been in the airport environment in Charlotte for more than 25 years through various buyouts and mergers. And initially, they had both lines of business. They operated food and beverage, and they also operated retail. In 2010, they gave up their rights to the retail in exchange for a contract extension, and we bid that process, went through a bid process, bid that contract out, and Parodies was selected. And you can see the evolution of these contracts. Right now, Host is expiring in 2030. Parodies is expiring in 2028. These contracts are extremely lengthy due to the investment that is required to operate in the airport environment and enabling allowing a term that enables them to collect the revenues necessary to amortize their investment. So what do the financials look like? We hit on this just a little bit earlier. We do have profit sharing with both of these companies. That is not always what you see in these agreements. We also have a fixed space rental that both of them pay. To give you an idea of what a rental rate in an airport actually looks like, we do have Class A space, Class B space, and Class C. The support space, of course, is not all created equal. They require warehousing space. They require commissary spaces, kitchens that are not in the units. So the rental rate for B and C space can span anywhere from $15 to $50 a square foot. And then the space that you're seeing in the public area of the terminal is actually more along the $71 a square foot. So this gives you kind of a recap of what this looks like. Each contract has an annual reconciliation associated with both of them, and that is where we are able to compare to the performance from last year and monitor some of the metrics associated with the contract. So you've been hearing a lot about relief in our environment, and Brent's presentation clearly indicated that we are in a very different place. What a difference 30 days can make. We were exceeding 50 million passengers and probably had one of the most successful concession programs in the country. And this situation has really decimated the program as we have known it. We have worked with all of our concessionaires to close businesses during this time, really at their will in consultation with us. We do have a contract provision that requires them to operate, but clearly our goal has not been to put any of these businesses under, and they are working on a skeleton crew right now. We do have, some people are still flying, as Brent mentioned, and we do have minimal operations functioning right now in the terminal building. I'd like to actually recognize both of them for being so creative during this time. They're actually doing things targeted at the employees that are there as well, operating a general store kind of environment to keep employees from having to go outside the airport while they are there. Can they pick up a couple of groceries and other things that are needed? Both of the groups have also done a lot of donations throughout the community right now, which I think has been very well received, particularly by the healthcare organizations that they've been working with. So this language that you're seeing on the screen is not verbatim from the contracts. These are paraphrased, but we are very fortunate that we have abatement provisions in our contracts. In talking with many airports across the country during this situation, we have learned that not many people have this, and they are having to negotiate as this situation has arose, which is making for a difficult time making decisions when people are under such duress, and requiring a lot of involvement from local political bodies as well. So our contracts do have some provisions for abatement. These are excerpts of the language, and you can see that each contract has an opportunity, if certain conditions are met, to receive rent abatement. In conjunction with these, the airport has taken the action to additionally defer any fixed space rental for the remainder of this fiscal year. We bill in advance, so the March bills have already been taken care of. But April, May, and June, we are deferring that rent, and it will not be due until January of 2021. Beyond June, we intend to follow the contract, and both of these abatement provisions will kick in if the situation continues as we know it today. We've been closely monitoring what's been happening with emplanements and what our traffic looks like, and we expect both of these. We know that during March that it has gone below 65%. So we expect both of these provisions to kick in. We work very closely. I will tell you, the language is not perfect. It really lacks clarity on some of the mechanics of how the abatement works. You know, both of these contracts have been negotiated at different times and places. Different people have been involved in those negotiations, not only on the airport side, but also on the concession side. So we've worked very closely with our legal counsel and with Host and Parodies to come to I feel like a very amenable spot for how we are going to apply this language moving forward during this time period. And those are all the slides that I have, and I'd be happy, Brent or myself, to take any questions you may have.
This is Victoria. I've got a question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I'm connecting the dots between the for 2021 and how that jives with what you just shared as far as the rent abatement. So the revenue projections on the remaining of this fiscal year and next year, does that consider, or how is that impacted by what you just shared? Have those two been compared against each other, or no? What's the assumption, I guess I'm asking,
Yes.
in projected revenue?
The simple answer, Councilwoman Watlington, is that yes, our finance team, in conjunction with Haley's team, and based on the recovery scenario, are making assumptions that rent is basically fully abated per the terms and conditions of the contract, and that is included in the previous presentation that I provided to you.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't see any other hands up. I had one quick question, Haley. The slide that you put up with those financials showing the revenues, is that the gross receipts by the concessionaires, or are those the payments among the concessionaires and the two lessees and the airport?
Okay, you actually have all of those figures on the sheet. You have the gross revenue for all of Host units, and then you have the net revenue. That net revenue you could divide in half, and half of that is what would be the net revenues for Host, and then half of that would be the net revenues for the airport. And the figure the next figure you see on the sheet that talks about the airport net revenues, that is not only the net from the sales, but it includes our fixed space rental. What you are not seeing in that total formula is the ACDBE. That's why we put an asterisk, because these numbers are very hard to compare apples to apples, but it is approximately 20% of that 178 million gross number, if that helps you discern that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's right. I want to see it on a piece of paper all laid out, but that was what I was getting at. Thank you, Haley.
We'd be happy to send you that offline.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any hands up. Are there any questions? If not, I think we could wrap up. I just want to say today's meeting was intended to provide a foundation of information for our continuing conversation. So next week, we're going to revisit the subject of the concessionaires with host and parties and representatives of the concessions and get a little further into their situation. And I think that's going to be one of our key goals here, particularly given the DBE component of the concessionaires at the airport from the city standpoint, and given our inclusion program is to identify areas where the greatest hardship might be occurring and think about what we might be able to do about that. But with that, we're done for now. If anybody has any questions or comments about format and so on, please feel free to get in touch with me. And if no one has anything else, thank you, Brent. Thank you, Haley. Thanks to the staff again for pulling all this together. And we will meet again next week at 10 o'clock. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.